I'm super excited about this one. We are live. We are recording, by the way, because you are the Chief Science Officer of Tailored Coaching Method now. And I'm really excited about this. This is something that's been, as we discussed on the phone weeks ago, something that's been on my mind for a long time. And I've watched other companies implement similar things, and I've seen other companies not implement this type of thing. And I see the direction of both. And I'm super happy that we're practicing what we preach, and we're doing everything we can to just keep bringing higher levels of education and research and quality information to what we do. And your first blog just came out on the website, so I'll link that in the show notes as well, which we've been getting a ton of great feedback on already. And I'm excited that we're going to be able to have you on the podcast once a month to just dive even deeper into stuff. So without any further ado, welcome Brandon Roberts to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Cody, and thanks for bringing me on the team. You know, I was looking into TCM and after your call, and I was like, wow, these guys got their shit together. So, you know, I thought it was a great opportunity to kind of jump in, and having someone with kind of my background is helpful, but, you know, the coaches do the hard work. The people at the forefront of the company that are the image, right? I'm just kind of like the nerd in the back who's like, no, don't do that. Yeah, do that. So, you know, I'm looking forward to it for sure.
Yeah, I love it, man. It was cool having the conversation with you, and then having the second conversation with you, because I could tell that you were more interested after you had a chance to do research, and that meant a lot to me because I respect you, and I've been respecting all the stuff that you put out. So knowing that somebody of your standard is like, okay, these guys pass the quota, like this is good shit, that means a lot to me. And like you said, like I think everybody, I like how you put it, like a nerd in the background doing that, but I think that if you don't have a nerdy side to yourself inside this industry, I think there's a problem. You know what I mean? Because that's where the passion for more education comes. And I think it's so important for people to just be constantly evolving. I see a lot of companies that don't prioritize furthering education. And I think that's such a problem because out of all the industries in the world, this industry is constantly evolving. The amount of stuff that changes inside of training and nutrition over time is just insane. So it's really important to stay up on the most current research, but then also just constantly trying to evolve as a coach to get better and better at your practice.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we've seen a good shift in those who are keeping up into the kind of evidence-based fitness realm. And you've almost seen like a little bit of a backswing now, but you know, science is there to support us, our coaching, our practices. We can pull from a lot of different bodies of literature, right? So maybe you want to be a physique athlete, or maybe you just want to like look good, right? Well, you can take a couple things from the obesity literature, a couple things from the like strength and conditioning literature, and you can kind of combine those and say, all right, well, maybe we don't have the full picture and exactly what I want to be, but I've got some evidence to suggest this might work. So let's try it. So that's the goal.
Yeah, 100%. So before we actually dive into your story, that actually brings up a really good question that I like to ask you. And I've asked a couple other people on the podcast because I always love getting people's opinion on this. But your definition of evidence-based, what does that actually mean in the coaching practice?
So in the coaching practice, it's different than like the medical realm, right? So I think there's a big distinction there because in coaching, we deal with an N of one every single time. Like you may have some group coaching or whatnot, but you're basically looking at a very small amount of people. And so you can have these wild variations, right? Now, like a medical doctor's looking at, especially if he's specialized, looking at the same type of patient over and over and over and over. So he has a set of practices. But I think for us, evidence-based practice is just taking some scientific background, some evidence of, you know, we think this will work, and applying it to our clients, our athletes, ourselves, and then adapting within certain ranges, right? So if we have, you know, evidence to suggest, and we do, that a high protein intake helps muscle growth, great. Now, the range is probably somewhere between 1.6 and 2.1 grams per kilogram. That's a pretty big range. So if we start at 1.6 and we're like, all right, well, I'm in my evidence-based recommendations, but I'm not seeing much. Maybe I go up to like 1.8, and that's the coaching aspect. It's like the ability to change things rather than just from a scientific perspective, measure them.
Got it. Okay. So, and what are your thoughts on evidence? When we look at evidence-based, I guess the way I'm trying to frame this is evidence isn't just research. Does that make
Mhm.
sense? Like, I
Yeah.
think a lot of people assume that like if you are evidence-based, it just means that you're literally taking research and you are applying it to your coaching, and it's like it's the doctor and you have to follow that exactly. But I think people forget that, there's a lot of things that can't be researched, or nobody will fund the researching on. So we have to look at our own coaching over the years and be like, okay, what's happening? Because everything we experience is actually evidence as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one thing that comes to mind off the top of my head is cues, right? So we have all these cues that we can give our clients, and we test them repeatedly, right? So we build an evidence base of, I think when someone squats, I should give them the cue of, chest up, because it'll make their hips sit back more, right? Or something like that.
Right.
So yeah, that experience is critical. And you look at the leaders in kind of in-person training for sure. And you go talk to them, and they're like, well, try this or try that. And it's like, well, how do you know? It's like, well, I've just done it forever. So that's definitely evidence for sure.
Yeah, I think you have to give a little bit of credit to some of the bro science. Obviously, there's some bro science that is just out of this world that you shouldn't follow, but I think that's important. So I do, because this is our podcast introducing you to the podcast and to the brand and everything, I do want to dive into your story just a little bit. So can you fill in the listeners with, I mean, how you even started all this? Like, why get into fitness, and then why take it so far as to chase your PhD? Because you kind of accomplished the highest level of like fitness nerd that you can possibly accomplish, And I think that when I look up to people who I'm taking information from, I mean, we got introduced basically through Eric Trexler, which is somebody that I would consider your colleague. People like him, Eric Helms, just happen to be two Erics, Greg Knuckles, people like that I'm looking at, and they're kind of accomplishing this level like you of being a researcher, being able to apply the research, being able to teach the research. And I think it's so important. But what made you go down that path? What made you chase it that far?
Yeah, so I kind of started in undergrad, and I knew I wanted to do some hard science. So I was like, okay, well, chose molecular biology because it kind of sets you up to do pretty much anything deep science based. And so I was a fitness fanatic during that time. I was not competing in bodybuilding or anything, but I went to the gym 5 or 6 days a week. I was very very bro, right? And I loved it, and I made a lot of my like beginner gains during that period. And then when I realized, kind of looking at grad school, I was like, all right, well, I don't really want to necessarily leave academia yet. I feel like I don't know enough, but I really love this fitness thing. So how can I move in that direction, coming from a deep science background where, I couldn't even walk in a gym and get a job because I didn't have an exercise science degree or, any real experience in that area. And so I did my master's in human performance, and that's when they started to kind of meld together. So the deep science and the fitness realm. And there I learned, best practices. I started training people in person. Um, that was a 2-year program. And during that time, I really fell in love with muscle biology, which is a lot of what I do now. And I said, well, I'm not quite there yet, because during my PhD, I was studying muscle loss, right? And nobody wants to lose muscle. We want to stop that from happening, but that still wasn't my passion. So I spent four years at a PhD. Did very well. I think I had a good mentor. Continued training other people during that time, right? So that's like 6 years of training people now in person. Um, and so that's when I realized, I was like, oh well, I've kind of reached the pinnacle, but I'm. This is funny because most people don't realize this, but I actually took it a step further. And so in academia, you can do a postdoc, which is basically a couple years of training under someone where you learn even more. You don't get a degree or anything. It's just like a post PhD. And so during that time, I realized I couldn't train in person anymore because the time just wouldn't allow it, but I could train online. And so I started at the end of my PhD training people online, and I've been doing that for about 5 years now. But I started moving more towards kind of the physique realm, the resistance training realm in my postdoc, and that's kind of where I've just finished, and now have this just love of molecular and applied sciences to strength conditioning, physique sport, and you can see it through my publication record. I just do a little bit of everything that I really enjoy. So that's kind of how I got there.
Can you explain muscle biopsy? Like, what is that, and like, how do you study that, and what are you studying? Because I think a lot of people hear that. They hear a lot of these different terms, and I don't think they truly understand what it is on the deepest level. Can you just give us that in a nutshell?
Yeah. So I'll define muscle biology and what a muscle biopsy is, because they're very related. Um, so muscle biology is just studying how muscle adapts to different things. It could be inactivity, right? So you say you break your arm and you're in a cast. Well, there's a set of molecular events that happen. So we have transcription factors and some biology that goes on that causes you to lose muscle, right? So if we could, for example, give you a drug that would stop that, that would be awesome. Now, on the other side, a different set of events happens when we gain muscle. So you've probably heard about like mTOR or things like that.
Yeah.
So you can look at those within muscle and say, oh, well, in this training program, we see a 10% increase, but in this one, we see a 100% increase. And that means that even though we may not do a long-term study, we can kind of say that this other training technique that caused a 100% increase is better. Um, and the way we really get at muscle biology is we either do um, animal studies, which I've kind of moved away from, or we take muscle biopsies. And muscle biopsies, I don't have a pen on me, but are basically where you shove a needle into someone's leg, you take a piece of their muscle, right? So you're not getting, this is why you don't see many physique athletes getting muscle biopsies, because they're taking a piece of muscle out of you and they're going to grind it up and look at all those pathways and say what's up, what's down, how are things changing compared to kind of like normal. So that's the essence of muscle biology. And if you've never had a muscle biopsy, they're not that bad, but they do actually take muscle out of your body.
Have you
So
had one before?
I have, yes.
Okay.
They're not too bad, but because you get to like numbed up and stuff.
Right.
It's not.
Is this where we are studying muscle fiber types and things like that? I know Andy Galpin has been huge on all that. And I'm assuming that's how he is getting that information.
Yeah. So you can look at muscle fiber types. You have the 2 or 3 or 5 different types depending on what you look at. Um, you can look at kind of force levels. So you could tease out one muscle and you could say, I got one muscle piece from a bodybuilder and I have one from a power lifter. Which one's stronger, like compared to size, and then which one's just stronger, right? Usually the power lifter is stronger.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that allows us to just look at the muscle. And like muscle has fat in it, so we can look at the fat within the muscle. It has mitochondria, it has all of these components of a normal cell, right? Um, I think the coolest thing about muscle is that it is multinucleated, which is it's only one of 2 tissues who have multiple nucleus in a cell, which means that it can send lots of messages, but also its muscle cells are huge. Like they can run like really big distances in your body. It's just one big cell with a lot of nuclei.
Do you have any opinion on this topic of, this is actually something that's funny because I wanted to ask you about this the other day. I was thinking about this. I can't remember what I read. I think it was just a simple post, but it was somebody's opinion on all the stuff they're studying with muscle fibers. And then back in the day, there used to be like this really hard train of thought that a lot of people had with training different body parts in different ways based on the fiber dominance, right? So if something is more fast twitch dominant, like the hamstrings, for example, let's do like low reps, let's do explosive stuff, let's do things like that, because that's how that muscle is going to build most. And then this muscle is more slow twitch, so do high reps with it. Do you think there is any, and now that stuff's actually coming out on this topic, do you think there's any value in that, or are we still at a point where it's like it's probably best to just do a little bit of both in every muscle group as far as rep ranges go?
Yeah, I don't think we're there quite yet. We're getting there, and in 5 or 6 years, we might have enough evidence to say, if we want to hypertrophy things, and we know that reps don't really matter. These couple studies say that if we're higher rep range here, maybe it's better. So I'm willing to do that, right? So I think that's the best we're going to get for now. But again, I mean, if you're going close to failure and you're getting enough volume, then like you can kind of do whatever you want.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of like I feel like, and this is actually funny because I feel like a lot of research has been showing this, even in nutrition, like it almost seems like the more and more research we do, the more and more we realize that it's really just calories that matter, you know, and for a lot of people, they hate that. And I'll be the first to say, like, I wish there was some cool, sexy strategy that would like, no, just do this style and it'll solve it. You know what I mean? Like it's this one
Yeah.
trick. Because we would all love that. It'd be cool, but that's just not the case. And I think the closest thing to that, which I've been really fascinated with, is all the information Danny Lennon has been putting out with chrononutrition, because
Hmm.
it's kind of flipping the calorie model around, not completely, but just showing that like maybe nutrient timing does play a bigger role than we once thought. Because for a while, people were like, it doesn't matter at all. Don't worry about timing your food, just hit your calories, which I think is kind of swinging too far in one direction.
Yeah, and you see that in the fitness realm especially, and it happens in the research too. In research, there's generally two camps for like everything. For some reason, there's never like three or four. There's usually just two. um,
Yeah.
so you have the Seco camp and the other camp who's like, no, a calorie is not a calorie. But I do wish there was some magical diet we could give people, and that's kind of why the ketogenic diet got so popular, was because it blunted hunger so much. And it's like, well, if I'm not hungry, I'm not going to eat. And well, that seems to work for a little while. But um, roping back to your Danny Lennon chrononutrition, I do think there's something there. I was actually in a seminar last Friday. We call it Friday Night Pints, and it's a bunch of scientists get around and just talk science for like an hour. Um, and one of the leading researchers on intermittent fasting and time restricted feeding was presenting. And she was like, we're running these studies now where we think that what Danny said actually is probably true, where if you shift your calories more towards the morning, you have maybe a potential for burning more or some positive effect. Now, we don't know that all the way yet, but I mean, if there's a chance that it'll help, I'm willing to try it, because ultimately I'm going to stay within the same calorie range anyway.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's one of those things too, where because I had Danny on and we talked about chrononutrition, did a really good job at breaking it down, and I had a lot of questions of like, when is it appropriate to start implementing those kind of things? And I always tell people, like, there's really this hierarchy of importance, in Eric Helms did a really good job of like founding that years ago and showing like the different stages. And I think it's important to look at that, but most importantly is to look at adherence first. So even if you're trying to bridge from one level to the next, or implement a new strategy, or change your timing, or add a supplement or anything like that, you always have to go back to like, can you adhere to it, right? Because maybe you do burn a little bit more calories, your energy expenditure is higher, so your maintenance level can be higher if you have more calories in the morning. However, you always have more stress at night and you end up craving food. I would say, hey, let's just save calories for night then. Have a smaller
Yeah,
breakfast so you can save room and then adhere better, because that's always going to kind of take precedence over it.
yeah, definitely. And when you look at nutrition studies, the dropout rate and the adherence rate are not that high. Like, they're not much different than probably what most of our athletes are seeing. Like, we actually have more dedicated people than what are in these studies, where you see a dropout rate of like 30% and an adherence rate of like 60%. So, you have to be really careful about that, and then how you apply it too.
Well, I think a lot of people don't even pay attention to that part of the study either. So they'll be like, well, like this study says this. And it's like, well, did you see how many people dropped out? And that might be a red
Yeah.
flag of like, it worked, but at what expense?
Yeah, yeah. I'm actually reviewing a study for Examine right now, where we're comparing, or they compared kind of intermittent dieting to like a straight diet. So you would either diet every other day really hard, or just diet a little bit each day. And I'm not done with it yet, but it's like the dropout rate in the hard diet every other day was like double. And it's like, well, okay, so if I'm going to lose half my population to that, I'm probably going to rethink it a little bit.
Yeah, 100%. That actually brings up another. I'm gonna love these podcasts, man, because I'm just gonna keep thinking of like all these things I can run by you. So something that I've been a big proponent of, my whole team has been diet breaks. We have seen amazing success with it in athletes and general population, just because it allows people to take a break from the diet, and we see better adherence. We can't really test to say like, oh, physiologically speaking, like you are improving metabolic adaptation or hormonal adaptation or anything like that. But based on your biofeedback and your stress levels, sleep levels, all these things, like I would probably predict that that's the case. However, there's some people coming out now who are basically saying that diet breaks don't actually work. Like it's just a mental thing. It's just a psychological break. There is no hormonal, or you don't even need it at all. Like, what is your opinion on all this? Because I hear these arguments and they're from people I really respect. And I'm like, it's a very solid argument. Like it makes sense what you're saying, your reasoning. I understand that. But my experience, and going back to the whole evidence-based thing, I'm like, my experience with working with, I mean, we work with hundreds of people every month. It's working. So like, where do we find this balance there?
Yeah. So the diet break like field is not very deep, right? So you've got a couple studies, a couple small studies. You probably don't have studies set up exactly how you're using it either. Like maybe, so Bill Campbell just came out with a study, and I briefly read it, so I don't want to talk too much about it. But it's on my analysis list. But yeah, so I think mentally, if they help, which they help me tremendously, there's no reason not to use them. I physiologically, maybe we don't have evidence, and maybe we won't ever have evidence, and then maybe it's just a mental thing, and that's totally okay. Like I'm going to use all my tools, and like you said, if it helps your clients, then that's the goal anyway.
Yeah. And I think what, it's funny that you mentioned Bill Campbell, because he sent it to me right when it came out. And I remember saying like, dude, this is awesome. Like, I'm glad you did this because these are the kind of studies that we need more of. And he was like, feel free to rip it apart because everybody else seems to be doing that. And I just said, I was like, man, I think that's always going to happen with a study because no study can be perfect. And people are always going to say like, well, you should have done this or you should have changed this. And it's like, okay, there's always something that can be changed. Like, are you the one doing the study? Like, I don't think so. But one thing I noticed with him, and I believe that they saw a better rate of muscle maintenance during the cut, right? And I would say like, if that is happening, at least performance is staying at a higher level. And if that's happening, you're maintaining more muscle, and like maybe even like some of these things I'm thinking of like, okay, maybe it's just psychological, maybe it's just performance being held up better, but nonetheless, indirectly, it still is helping physiologically speaking, because you're probably going to end in a healthier, better physique at the end of it. And that's still like, you know what I mean? So people are so focused on, well, we didn't see a rise in leptin on that diet. And I think they're kind of missing the forest for the trees, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, and oh man, well, I'll do like a mini blog about leptin sometime because the time you test it matters so much. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, you're also looking for in these shorter studies, like 8, 10, 12 weeks. I mean, yeah, we will probably diet that long. Like the 12-week diet's pretty standard for a mini cut, or a little bit longer than a mini cut, maybe like a midi cut. But if you can get some advantage or perceived advantage, then let's try it. I tear up a lot of studies. I peer review probably like 3 studies a month, but that doesn't mean that I don't think they're important. I think it's like, well, in peer review, it's let's make this even better, or at least tell people more clearly what's wrong with it, and that's okay. Every study, like you said, has flaws, and you can't design the perfect study. You just want to make sure that whatever question they're trying to get at or what they're trying to say from the data matches what the data actually says. And usually it does. So that's good. But yeah, I mean, I think we need a lot more studies that are a little more realistic for people to apply.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think this actually is going to kind of lead us into the research that we're going to cover today. But I think that both of the studies you sent over my way that we're going to talk about were done on physique athletes. And one thing I tell a lot of coaches that are looking to just build their business or build their coaching practice is to study bodybuilders. Like I see a lot of people that are like, well, I just work with everyday people. And I'm like, okay, but who is the absolute best at getting rid of body fat and maintaining muscle, which is a form of maintaining health in a sense? Bodybuilders. So study what they do and do it at a less extreme variation, or just not as long of a cut, because sometimes preps can, I mean, now I feel like preps are a year long compared to like back in the day. when I did my prep, you bought a 12-week prep. That's what
Yeah.
it was. But now it's just like 36 weeks, 48 weeks, it's just like goes up and up. But point being is you can just kind of not do it at such an extreme, and that's probably going to be the best bet for them. Now, some things you might not, I tell people you might not have to get as strict, but at the end of the day, I think most bodybuilders naturally just eat like bros. So you don't really have to promote them to be strict. We know flexible dieting works anyway. But the reason I'm saying this is because I love the research that you sent me, and I've loved. I believe you were a part of a research study, correct? That was done on bodybuilders as well. I think you did it with
So
Eric Jones.
we did, yeah. So I led a review, and I mean, it wasn't like a true study; it was just a review. But it's
Okay,
a review of all the physique literature with Helms and Trexler and
got it.
Peter Fitchen, and that is actually a really good resource because we wrote it in a way that, like, lay people should be able to understand it. It's a little long, but you could break it up into parts. But yeah, that, and it's open access, it's free. You can like Google it or follow me somewhere and it's there. But yeah, that was a lot of fun to work with those guys and kind of figure out like what do we want to recommend for these physique athletes in terms of ranges and like post competition and all this other stuff.
Yeah, I love that. And I'll have you send me that link, and I'll post all the links in the show notes so people can go check it out. But I think that stuff is so valuable for everybody in the coaching space because it's the closest thing that we can get to working with really anybody. It doesn't matter if they're a bodybuilder or not. Like, this is applying to fat loss and muscle growth, period.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody who we work with, almost everybody except the few people that are like, I just want to get stronger, or some people want to just feel better. But the majority is like, I want to look better naked. Like, that's the goal, right? So whether you're competing or not, this stuff's going to apply. And we can kind of dive into the first one if you want. The first one I love because I was excited to see, because I'm a proponent of higher carb diets. It doesn't mean low carb diets don't work. I still use those with some clients because, like you mentioned, the satiety effect with keto. I have some clients that it just works better with a high fat. But I know for me personally, and for a lot of people who are after more aesthetic approaches, I think a higher carb approach works better. And I think this study kind of alluded to that being more common in successful bodybuilders, which would make us think that that's true.
Yeah. And so this is one of my favorite studies, and it's just a survey study. Well, not just, but it is a survey study, which a lot of people don't value much. But when we look at, so this study was Chappelle 2018. He's actually a good researcher, a good bodybuilder himself. But he just surveyed the nationals at British National Bodybuilding Federation at nationals, right? And so you're looking at high level competitors, like people who are winning titles and things. And so these are the upper echelon of physique athletes. And, just gave them a simple survey. It was like, what's your nutrition been like over the past prep? What are, so some of them track body fat and things like that. What kind of habits do you have? What kind of supplements did you take? Or, just kind of getting a feel for what they're doing because they're winning, right? And then after he got all the data, right, he split them into top 5 finishers, right? So these are the people we really want to be. And then the people who didn't place, right? Still probably really good athletes, but not quite as good. And like you mentioned, one thing that kind of stuck out was the people who finished top 5 ate more carbs. And so I'm kind of looking at this paper, and as I was rereading it, I was like, okay, well that makes a lot of sense. And it's all the measures are normalized to body size or body weight, right? So it's grams per kilogram, and the ranges for pretty much everybody in the study were 2.7 grams of protein to 3.3. Like they're all in that range. The carbs range from 4 to 5.1 or something. Which grams per kilogram, that's a lot of carbs. And then the fat, which is something that I've written about recently, but was pretty low. It was at like 0.8 grams per kilogram. It didn't really change across the prep. In males, it changed a little bit. In females, it dropped from 0.8 to 0.6. But
so that's, not to cut you off, that's like what, like 2.5 grams per pound, maybe?
yeah,
0.4.
I think
Like
so.
it's like
They
in
were
that lower range.
To give you some like more realistic numbers, stop talking kilograms at you. I think it was like 40 to 50 grams of fat for those males, and probably 30 to 40 grams for the females. Um, but yeah, so this just tells us, all right, well, we have some survey data to show that maybe high carb diets are a little bit better. Maybe they help you place better. Um, the prep length, like you mentioned, the prep length has just expanded and kept on expanding. I think my 2016 prep was 36 weeks, and my 2019 prep was 30. And these competitors were averaging about 22 weeks, plus or minus 9 weeks was the standard deviation. But yeah, I thought that was like anybody could go read that study. I'm pretty sure it's open access too, and just get some insight to what these elite bodybuilders and physique athletes are doing. And that was the basis of our whole recommendation paper was, hey, let's use, there's a couple other surveys like this, let's use these survey data and say, okay, this is what bodybuilders are doing at the elite level. So now we can tie in the scientific data of, there's a study showing that one protein intake versus another, the higher one's better. Okay, so now we can say these two together say maybe we should have higher intake because we've got both sides of the equation. So that was kind of the fun part of the review. But yeah, so that first study, I don't know if I missed anything major, but there's a lot of stuff in it.
Yeah. I guess the one thing I would ask is like, is there anything else that you saw that stood out to you that is at least worth people understanding to implement? And then the second thing is like, why do you think that the higher carb approach led to more muscle maintenance throughout the process? And I would probably venture to say that if it led to more muscle maintenance during an off season, it would probably lead to more muscle growth. Now, is that because there's an inverse relationship with insulin and cortisol, and maybe we have less stress placed on the body? Is it because they just trained harder because they had more fuel? Is it because there's a muscle protein synthetic response? Like, is there anything that would tell you like, oh, that makes sense because of this exact thing? Or do you think it's just like, oh, they probably just had more fuel in the tank in the gym?
Well, so there's two things. I think, like you mentioned earlier, the workouts were probably better. Higher carb intake tends to lead to better workouts. The cortisol thing, I'm not sure about that one. I think the next study gets into that a little bit, and you'll see that there's not many changes in cortisol. But what was I going to say? Man, I lost it. I think there is definitely some influence on training. And damn, I lost it.
Training is probably, I think people forget like how important training intensity is to maintain muscle, because a lot of people think about eating protein as the way to increase muscle protein synthesis, which is something we want during a cut, right? But people forget that resistance training, has that same effect on our body. That's a very big stimulus for muscle protein synthesis. Do you think that that's something people need to focus more on? Is like, because obviously like, and it's a double-edged sword, because as we go on a diet, it becomes harder and harder to keep intensity high, yet it becomes more and more important.
Yeah, I think it is more important. And that was the other thing I was going to mention was the MPS response. So we have enough science now to tell us that carbs don't really influence the protein synthetic response much. So I don't think there's a lot going on in that aspect. I just gave a lecture on muscle protein synthesis, and I was looking at it and I was like, initially we thought, and the bros back in the 80s and 90s, they would have their shake with, quick sugar. And you look at the data back then and you're like, no, that's exactly what the data said. Like they were doing the right thing. They were just following science. But now 20 years, 30 years later, it's like, well, actually it wasn't the carbohydrate. It was just they weren't eating enough protein, or they were giving it slightly differently than it should be given. Or it wasn't like the full complement of proteins. So I don't think there's a huge difference there, but I would, double down on the training aspect for sure. There was also and since it was normalized, the carbohydrate intake was normalized to body weight, there could also be a higher muscle mass in those people, which you would expect in the top 5. right? And so if you have higher muscle, you can probably eat more carbs. So I think that might be a little bit of it, but I think there was a big enough difference between the groups to say, I'm okay with higher carbs.
It's funny because I remember writing a blog about carbohydrates at least 2 years ago. It was a while ago, but like one of the arguments I made was what you were just saying. And there was some research that made you believe that, but this is a good example of the diet breaks too. Like, this is what we think, but we just need more research. Like, everything needs more than one study to be like for sure. You know what I mean? Like, even if we go back to CICO, like calories in versus calories out, how many studies have been have been done to prove like, yep, this is really like the biggest thing that matters. This is always going to overrule. And I'm sure when the first study came out, there was plenty of people who were not in the CICO camp that were like, no, that's not how it works. Look at this, look at this. But over time, as more research comes out, I think we can have more indefinite decisions on these type of things.
Yeah, and as an academic too, I will always put that line in my papers because I just enjoy doing research. I'm like, so you want me to write in a paper somewhere that we don't like, case closed, we're done here, just walk away? Like, I would get murdered. So I'm not going to do that, and I definitely agree with you. We need more. We just need more. There's more you can find out. That's the nice thing about science is
Yeah.
everything builds on each other. So we
Yeah.
learn a little bit. Oh, now let's test this.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's funny too. You're probably familiar with mass research review, and anybody listening would recognize this too. But I encourage anybody who is or who isn't, go subscribe. It's great. But those of you who are, always go down to the bottom of their write up and look at like applications and takeaways. I think it is. It always starts with, I would like to see blah, 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 because they're always like, next time I think we should do this. Or next time we should do more research. And it's because exactly what you said, there's always going to be something that pops in the researcher's head, like, or the reviewer's head, like, this would be cool, or this would give us more info. And I think that's what makes me so excited about having you on the team, is because it's constantly evolving and it's so fun for me to absorb it. Especially because I'm a geek at heart. I'm subscribed to all the research reviews. I have been for years. So the fact that I have somebody on my team that does that too is really cool. But cool. I think that study is, I think you explained it well. I think that's really applicable to people. I think the biggest takeaways are, carbs can be pretty important for muscle maintenance, possibly just through performance, but nonetheless, it is what it is, and it might be something that you want to utilize. It gives some good recommendations on like the minimum amount of fat needed inside of your diet, and I think that's important for people, because as keto got bigger, I think a lot of people, especially in the general pop, started assuming that more fat meant like better health or better hormones. And I think there's like a misconception there where people are like, oh, well, I need at least 50 grams fat, but if I consume 80, I'm going to supercharge my testosterone. And it's like, well,
Oh man,
I don't think that's the case.
no.
And actually that's a good question for you is that, and then also, does it actually have more to do with just calories? Because I see a lot of studies that talk about like the hormonal effects and keeping fat up and so on and so forth. And I'm like, they're in a deficit. So I think no matter what their fat's going to be, they're probably going to see some adaptations over time, because that's just part of what happens when you diet.
Yeah, and I think when I wrote the recommendations paper with the guys, I think we kind of saw that. We were like, there's the idea that testosterone drops off or your hormones drop off because of just your fat intake lowering when you have your calories dropping off like by 600 or 700, plus you're doing all this cardio, plus you have stress. Like, I don't think fat matters as much as people think. I know you need a certain level, right? There are fat soluble vitamins that you really, really need. But to say there's a big difference between 50 grams and 80 grams, probably not. Unless it's an adherence effect. When dieting, to say, I'm at 15% of my calories are fat versus 10% of my calories are fat, I don't know if that's really going to matter that much. So yeah, I probably know, I will say, I know the least about fat of the macronutrients, but I am pretty confident that it's more to do with calories than fat intake specifically.
Yeah. Few things to just add on to that before we move on to the next one. First and foremost, Coach Lise on our team just wrote a blog she sent to me this morning that'll come out as this airs. tomorrow. It'll be out tomorrow. And it's like 5,000 words of just about fat. It's literally like,
Ooh,
I think we're
nice.
calling it the complete guide on fat, dietary fats. And she did a really good job breaking down all the just different types of fats and what to focus on and the recommendations depending on your goal and so on and so forth. So I just reviewed it this morning. I was like, this is amazing. So I'm excited to get that out. The other thing I was going to say too is like, I think that percentages of your diet are good for like, hey, like you probably shouldn't go below this percentage of your calories and fat during a deficit. But I think it's important for people to remember too, that that's all relative on the calorie intake. So people are like, well, I need at least 20% of my fat from, or my calories from fat, right? And it's like, well, you're in a huge surplus to gain weight. You really don't need to focus on that. Just get, you know what I mean? So like, even for
Yeah.
me, I'm below 20% right now, but I'm in a surplus trying to gain size, and we're leaving more room for carbs because I function better that way. So that's a good thing for people to remember too. And then the last thing is just an observation. I can think of one guy specifically. He's actually our intern getting into Ready Work with us, but I prepped him for a show and he won. And he actually got a chance to compete for his pro card. Unfortunately, didn't get first on that and didn't get his pro card, but he won the first show. And I remember taking him out of the diet afterwards, and he literally he was like, I felt things change when I got just below 50 grams. Like I think the lowest we got his fat was like 45 grams, but he was like, as soon as we dipped below 50, I immediately started feeling it. But as soon as we reversed and got me back to like 55, 60, I felt so much better. And it was like, I don't know if that was a mental thing or if he just had that like threshold where it just clicked in, but just food for thought for people listening.
Yeah, definitely. And there are, I mean, fat's really important for a lot of things, but I do like your point about percentages. You have to be careful. The reason we put those as a percentage, fat specifically, into the recommendations for physique athletes is because I didn't feel comfortable saying you need zero point 0.9 grams per kilogram or you need a specific number. I just don't think there's enough good data to give like a kind of cutoff like we did with the other ones, even a bigger range. But
Yeah.
yeah.
I used to say 0.4 grams per pound. And then I was like, you know what? There's a lot of times where it's like 0.3 is totally fine. And then
Yeah.
I've even been like, man, like 0.25 is fine. You know what I mean? So I think you're totally right. Like it really is just so dependent on the individual. Let's bring up the next study that you had. I believe this is kind of similar, but it's looking at more of the adaptations that occurred during the deficit, I believe.
Yeah, well, so this one is, so we had the first one was like pre-contest. This one's a little bit more post-contest.
Got it.
And this one's actually from Trexler. So he's the first author on this, and this was during his PhD work, I think. But until this study came out, this 2017, we didn't have a lot of good studies showing what happens after a prep. Because if you've ever talked to someone coming out of prep, they are like super hungry all the time. They feel like they're gaining muscle, and because they're training really well, and they have all of these kind of like issues going on. So this study followed, I think it was 15 physique athletes right before their competition, like a week after. So a week before, so that's a week before the competition, which means they didn't have any peak week measurements, which is really important because people do some crazy stuff during peak week. A week after their competition. So that's like, okay, I had my pseudo binge after a competition. I've had a week to kind of get back to normal, find maintenance, and start training. And, I'm more like what I'm going to be for the next couple of weeks. So a week after competition. And then another outcome at 4 to 6 weeks post competition. And the window is there. It's 4 to 6 weeks because they had to get the people into lab and stuff. And it gets a little hectic with scheduling. But basically what they saw was post competition, right? You see an increase in body weight. It's like, duh. The first week after their competition, they had an increase in lean mass, but that was probably because they were eating more, like that they didn't actually gain any muscle. Because when you look at the last time point, so 4 to 6 weeks post competition, there was no lean mass changes. So that means that they kind of had this rebound after they refed for a week, and they kind of just leveled out, right? But what happened during that period, that 4 to 6 week post competition, they were gaining fat. It's like pretty much pure fat, which is very much needed, right? You want to get back to a homeostasis. You want to be able to maintain your weight You want to let your hormones recover, which is another thing they looked at. So they measured testosterone, ghrelin, and leptin. So ghrelin and leptin are hunger hormones. Leptin inhibits hunger, and then ghrelin kind of increases your appetite. And so what they found was basically, leptin didn't really change much. Testosterone started to rebound in the guys a little bit. So I think there's like a 20% increase 4 to 6 week post, which matches some other literature, but it wasn't fully recovered. If you compare it to other studies, they didn't have a super pre time point, so you can't compare it directly. But hormones tend to recover somewhere between 4 and 6 months after prep. So this kind of matches that. This was like one of the first studies on post-competition period, like I said. Their metabolic rate, so when you diet, I think you mentioned earlier, your metabolic rate drops a little bit more than we predict it would, and it's not much. It's like 10 to 15%. But that actually rebounded because after competition, they were overeating. So the metabolic rate, if you overeat, your metabolic rate increases. Now, it won't increase at a rate that you won't gain fat, but it does increase. And we know that from the overfeeding literature, basically where they fed people a bunch. So that's kind of what they found. They just said, these people gain fat. It's probably due to this drive from ghrelin in hunger. So they're hungry all the time. And if you, like I said, if you've ever prepped, you're just hungry for like 3 months. It's ridiculous. And then they gained a little muscle, but they didn't gain any extra muscle. And you can assume that they're training right during that period. And if there was a time, some people feel like they're going to gain a bunch of muscle, especially a week after prep. They're like, oh, I'm ready, I'm recovered, and you're not really recovered. Yeah. So that was a thought for a long time, was like, oh, I get a post-competition rebound, and it's really just a post-competition like glycogen hydration.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, I remember it being like, that's your anabolic window, essentially. Like you're insulin sensitive and you need to and I think, I want to say it was Lane Norton who said this, but he was like, yeah, your fat cells are anabolic as well. So like, don't be too trigger happy with the food post competition. I wrote a blog probably a couple months ago on reverse dieting and metabolic adaptation, and I highly encourage people to go check that out. I'll link in the show notes, because I do talk about this effect during a deficit and how your metabolism does adapt, and how it might not be something that needs to scare you, because it makes sense. You lose weight, you have less mass, you need less calories to survive. It's pretty simple. But there's some good resources in there as well. I think I linked to a couple different research studies, and also Eric Trexler's blog, which if you want to read a book, it's like 26,000 words. But it's good. I actually printed it out because I was like, I'm going to actually like highlight this and like read it. But it's really, really good. But I'll link those in the show notes for people to check out, just so you can get more information. My question for you would be kind of like applying this to the general population. Like, what do you see being the most valuable information inside that for people to listen to? Because I know a lot of people will go, oh, well, I'm not prepping, and those people take it to extremes. I'm not going to have those effects. But I'd have a lot of people consider that, when I get on the phone with somebody and they're like, oh, I've been trying to diet for a year and a half, and, like the deficit never works. And I really look at their food logs and I look at what they've been doing. I'm like, you kind of have been in a cyclical diet for the last year, 2 years. Yeah, that's going to have just as bad of an effect on you as a 12 to 20 week prep will. It's not as extreme in the short term, but it's even more extreme in the long term. And I think people need to remember that as well.
Yeah. And we see that a lot. Like throughout my career, I've seen that where you're just kind of losing the same 5 pounds over and over again. And for kind of practical purposes, I think, there's some other literature that shows for every, I think it's pound, it might be kilogram, I can't remember right now. For every pound you lose, your appetite increases like 90 calories worth. And so you have this divergence, right? So where you're losing weight, say you lose 20 pounds. Well, that's not super abnormal. Most people can lose at least 10, and that's where they want to be at, somewhere in there. But now you have this monstrous calorie increase where you're like, I'm hungry all the time. And so I think changing your food types can help. So food volume helps a little bit. Being prepared to just be like, okay, this is my maintenance. I'm going to sit here and I'm going to reverse diet out of it. Not to do anything specifically metabolic, but I want to find my new maintenance and I want to feel good. And I need to make sure that I don't binge or overeat because I've lost all this weight and now I'm hungry.
Yeah.
And it can be like, it doesn't have to be 20 pounds like a bodybuilder. It can be like 5 pounds with some people. So just being aware that it happens and adjusting your food choices maybe is pretty big from what I've seen.
Yeah, I would agree. I think I did a podcast, I think it aired last week as this is going out, and I called it Cody Rants, and I just went on some topics, and somebody like sent me this thing about like their confusion on a calorie being a calorie. Is a calorie really just a calorie depending on what you eat? And my whole thing was like, logically speaking, yes, a calorie is a calorie, but I think we have to remember that going into a deficit or doing a reverse diet or anything, these things, you have to look at the composition of those calories in order to get the most out of those calories. So how, like, if you're used to eating 5 meals a day and that works great for you, but now you're in a 500 calorie deficit, you might want to maybe to have like a 12-hour fasting window. So you bring your meals closer together, have bigger meals, but less meals per day. That might have a more satiety promoting effect on you, even if it's just mentally, or like you said, like more filling calories, more voluminous food. So a sweet potato versus a Pop-Tart is kind of like always my comparison. Like, what's going to be more filling, not only from a nutrient perspective, but just the size of a sweet potato is going to fill you up more. And I think that's pretty obvious. And the calories can be the same and the weight loss effect can be the same, but that sweet potato might actually allow you to adhere better long term. And this is kind of always my argument against flexible dieting is like, flexible dieting is important, but being too flexible can actually hurt you because now you're trying to play macro Tetris and fit all these things in your diet. And it's hard for you to adhere because you're not satiated. You're not getting the nutrients you need. Maybe digestion isn't great. This is where my argument for eating like a bro actually, I think, holds up really well. Cause it's like, eating like a bro most of the time or just whole minimally processed foods might be better for adherence, but always keeping in mind that flexibility matters because when the weekend hits and you do want to go have a burger, go for it. But like, I think there's that balance you need to find.
Yeah, and I agree. I honestly eat like a bro most of the time, but like we have pizza and beer on Friday nights, and that's not bro. I mean, well, it is kind of, but you know what I mean.
Different kind of bro.
Different kind of bro. But yeah, I think if you get to macro tetrasy, you can actually, that's steering towards like a eating disorder, right? Yeah. So you don't really want to go that way. And in our review on physique athletes, a big part of it is the mental aspect, which definitely not my area of expertise, but is really, really important of like controlling disordered eating, because if you start a prep or even if you start a diet, there's a higher chance of you having disordered eating issues. So, something important.
Yeah. And I think there's kind of a fine line between eating disorders and disordered eating. And I think a lot of people, they don't consider disordered eating as something different. They just think, oh, I don't have an eating disorder. But a disordered eating, I would say, is a less of a degree, but it's something that's more prevalent than people realize. I think more and more people actually do have disordered eating and they don't realize it.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely agree with you there. So
I love it, man. I think that's that kind of covers everything that we can hammer out on this first podcast. It was cool to introduce you. I'm glad people get to know who our CSO is now and get to know your story a little bit and see your expertise. And before we leave, like the last question I'll ask you is, and I've kind of already shared my opinion on this, but what is the impact you want to create being in this position? I think some people that are more of our colleagues reach out to me like, dude, that's awesome. Brandon's a great guy. That's a good move. And the other people are like, what's a CSO? Like, what are you doing? And it's like kind of this new thing. And I'm like, it's important for people to see these kind of things. Cause I think it's really important for companies to have stuff like this. So what is what do you want your role to be as far as impact?
Yeah. So I just want to help like our coaches and anyone listening, any of our followers, right, understand how we can apply science to practice, to put it simply. We're not going to, take one study and make these profound claims. We're going to kind of stay patient, consistent, and really conservative in applying the science to athletes and help our coaches understand. And I mean, your coaches are already pretty dang smart. So I don't know how much I can teach them, but just be a resource, for everybody. And if you guys have questions, like whoever is listening right now, you can DM me, or email me or however you want to contact me, and I'll try to get back to you, as soon as I can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to link all the studies we talked about, as well as the blog that Brandon just wrote for us, in the show notes. I will link his Instagram and everything like that, so you guys can get a hold of him. And then for the members and the clients listening to this, he is actually in our Facebook group as well. So we have access to him there for help as well. So feel free to tag him, and ask him questions, and we'll probably figure out a way to do Q&As and stuff in there eventually. But awesome, man. This was great. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks for having me, Cody, and I'm so excited to join your team, man.